Georgi, as you know, September is anniversary month. Today is the 34th anniversary of Armenia's independence. 2 days ago, we had the second anniversary of the beginning of the ethnic cleansing of the final assault on Artsakh. So what we're going to do is we're going to look back and then look forward. When we're talking about what happened 2 years ago on September 19th and the week and the 10 days after that, I have a theory that what died in that road from Berdzor back to Armenia was not just a chance of a real peace and understanding, but also the Second Armenian Republic. Because the Second Armenian Republic, which was established in 91, has as its raison d'etre the protection of Artsakh. And it sort of lost that, and what we actually, the period that we're living in is actually the Third Armenian Republic. And I want to run that by you to see what you think of that. Is that something that, are we onto something, or are we off chart when we're thinking that?
We are very much in the historical trend. We are in a calamity period. We might not be noticing it because let's have a sense of proportion. Nothing like what our grandfathers and grandmothers had experienced, or great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers. My own grandmother was a Cossack woman, and as you realize, I'm only about 1/4 Armenian. She refused to remember anything between 1914 and 1950. That period, she would turn pale. So I knew very little. I asked her once, where were the battle crosses of my grandfather and his dagger? He was Cossack artillery officer at the fortress of Kars. And she would turn pale like chalk and say, nothing, nothing, I drowned everything in this swamp when this demon collectivization happened. And that very heavy machine gun, it was so demon heavy. So wow, so we had a machine gun too. So yeah, he brought it back from World War I. So this is almost nothing compared to it, but think of it this way. What will be Ukraine 5 years from now? This war will end. Not this year, probably, but what will be Russia? People ask me, that Russia, maybe provocatively, ask me, that Russia managed to survive in economic isolation. Yes, with Chinese cars flooding their market, they're selling aluminum, and now it sounds almost ridiculous, that Russia is supplying turnips to China, among other things. Or tapinambur, getna henzor. Who knew that Russia would be an exporter of getna henzor, the tapinambur fruit. But what is the future for a place like Russia? What is the future? And we should be asking this very earnestly. What is the future for a place called European Union? What is the future of the neighboring so-called republic, the dictatorship in Azerbaijan? What's happening to them? What is the future of Iran? What is the future of the United States in 5 or 10 years? So we are in a moment of collapse, which is always a foundational moment for something else. What is that something else? We don't know yet. So in a sense, Armenia is sadly ahead of curve. Because to remind you, in 2023, I was commissioned to write an editorial for the New York Times about what was happening in Artsakh.
During the blockade?
In the very last days, when it was obvious, my first phrase was that the presence of Armenians in Karabakh was ended in the conflict in Karabakh was ended in the old-fashioned manner of siege, starvation, conquest, and expulsion. So this is how things had happened over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. What do you think the Roman conquest of the Gaul was like? So there were genocides all over ancient history, or people turned into slaves. But back to my op-ed at the New York Times, It was submitted on late in the evening on Thursday, and the editor told me that it appears on Monday morning. Friday, I think was it Friday? So 7th of October, there is Hamas attack in Israel. And I thought it would never appear there. So it appears actually on Monday, very poignantly, just next, the front page. Ghastly photos in the New York Times were from Israeli kibbutz attacked by Hamas, and next to it, my column saying that Karabakh is a window into our future. This is what the world of lawless aggression would look like. So this is where we are now.
Well, it's a sobering thought, but I think it's sadly, if you look at everything since September of 23, everything is in that direction, if not worse, actually. Getting to more practical politics, when we're talking about if we actually believe that we're actually in the Third Republic, one of the features of this republic is, which is entirely different from what was before 23, is Armenia's Western orientation. Now, that Western orientation might have been by default, it might have been by you have no choice, or it might have been a conscious decision. And married to that is the collapse of the Russian position in this region, and in Armenia specifically. And there's very specific criticisms that come from people who that don't necessarily even need to be pro-Russian, because I think it's a legitimate position that needs to be discussed, that the Western pivot is dangerous and that Armenia has no options but to be part of the greater Russian political security system. What do you think of both of these ideas? First of all, what do you think of the past Western pivot? Was this something that was thought out, or something out of desperation, or there was no other option? Or what do you think of people who still think that Russia is any kind of a possible partner, a security partner for Armenia moving forward?
For those who know Russian literature, or at least Russian film, let me remind you Nikolai Gogol, one of the greatest writers, who is responsible for imagining, in the 19th century, he imagined both Russia, the dead souls, and Ukraine. The famous novel Taras Bulba, about the 17th century rebel, Cossack rebel commander, leader in Ukraine. He confronts his son who switched sides during battle, and asks him famously, "Did your Poles help you much?" "Ну что, помогли тебе твои ляхи?" This is the question to be remembered. But at the same time, I'll remind you another classic, Vladimir Lenin, who said that there exist two Russias. He says that before the revolution, he says that addressing to the nationalities of Russian Empire. Yes, there is the oppressive Tsarist, the prison house of the peoples, of the nations. Yeah. And then there is the other Russia of Leo Tolstoy and Russian culture and Russian intelligentsia. And this is where Armenia is not just at the pivot, right at the crossroads, because Armenia became, importantly enough, how many people noticed, the salvation destination, the destination for salvation of some of the best cadres from Russia. We hold them in trusteeship. We help them to escape.
Post-22, after the Ukraine.
Post-22, yeah. So the anti-war Russians. As a sociologist, I can have some data there. 99% with university degrees. 32 years old on average. So this is kind of your dream immigration. Yes, many of them left and spread. They're young people, so there are many opportunities there, and there are not enough opportunities perhaps here, but quite many remained. And even those who had left, they do remember Armenia. So one of my students who teaches now at, let's say, a famous, very elite American university, which might attract some hostile attention from both Washington and Moscow, said that, I realized that this war, he means the war in Ukraine, is for a long time. In the beginning, we all thought that we are just escaping for a few months, a few weeks perhaps. Now we realize that this is a good chunk of our lives. And the second thing we all realize is that Armenia could be the closest thing to motherland we have. Which is very strange to hear it from Russians, or actually from ethnic Tatars, I hear from Bashkirs, from Muslims, but you are at the same time a kind of real post-Soviet republic in the sense that I just showed you this wonderful picture from the Cascade. Opera house to the left, library to the right, Avitiki Sakyan, the great street here, great eateries, and so this is truly a European capital, East European capital of culture. This is a post-Soviet republic and one of the very few which are obviously going to make it. And I think we can discuss it, why obviously, and what does it mean we're going to make it? We are making it already. So the pivot, as you described it, because as all American undergraduate students know, the correct answer is usually all of the above. Which one? Of course, it happens in adverse circumstances. But you have to remember, that Russia of Vladimir Putin made blunders, mistakes. They walked into a quagmire in Ukraine. When people are telling me, that they're not doing that bad, they say, yeah, except, that now they have to fear Finland and Sweden with their Saab and Volvo is actually making weapons for the NATO alliance. And now they depend on, so something is actually really very troubling happening there. So I'm not sure whether there would be a destination for those Russians to return, honestly, because that future is in darkness. It's very difficult to forecast. For Armenia, there is very little to do in this situation. So the people who are telling you that we can get with Russian help back into Karabakh, they're lying. And the people who are telling you, that Europeans are going to save us, they're lying too. That's the problem. So nobody is going to help us. And the people who are saying that we are going let's raise our voice, let's come back to our values or something. You must have heard this many times. They are just pouring salt over the fresh wounds. Let's be very sober. This is the moment when you have to be very sober because you've been kicked very hard. We are prostrate on the floor. Let's face it. And we are not dead yet. Just like the Ukrainian and the Polish anthems, national anthems go, Ukraine has not perished yet. Armenia has not perished. We are still here, but how could we survive in this world where everyone seems to be losing, if not doing very greatly? I remind you, Israel, are they winning their war? On the other hand,
technical terms, yes.
Yeah. What's going to happen after this war to Israel? Is Iran winning their position? Are they strengthening their position? Or look at China. If they're so great and formidable, why Taiwan is still there? One after another, so there are no success stories in the world. There are only some stories of survival, and that's where we are.
I think, well, what's interesting here is you're saying something quite insightful because there's this whole notion of, you'll hear about the BRICS rising, China rising. The fact is, if you really look deep into it, even the regional powers that people are rising, they're all declining just at different scales in different ways. I mean, people talk about like Turkey as a regional power that's rising. How can they be rising when statistically 40% of kids go to bed hungry and 80% of young people want to leave in polling? So what you're describing is world systems falling apart, really, in so many ways. I want to go back to something specific about September 23. From the Russian rule after Russia failed to win the war in Ukraine in the first 2 weeks. It was very obvious that the Azeris, Turks, however you want to describe them, will make a move against Artsakh. Artsakh's fate was in many ways sealed when the Russian invasion of Ukraine failed. I think there's a reasonable chance to be made, a reasonable case to be made. Ilham Aliyev, during that time, had a choice to make. He could have chose ethnic cleansing, which is what he did. He could have chosen another path, which would have meant something much softer or lighter, something less criminal. But he chose ethnic cleansing. So the issue is, and he's obviously a rational actor. He's not an irrational actor. Did he choose ethnic cleansing? Was that a sign of strength? Is that a sign of weakness? Or was it the internal rhetoric was such for 30 years that you could not have another outcome? What motivated him to make the decision that he did?
There are so many questions about the mind of dictators, and we don't know. Let's be honest about it. We don't want to get into those minds either. You know. We can. It's very much like one of my great friends, a Russian biologist, Evgeny Petrov, used to say that he used to be very irritated when simpletons at his public lectures ask him questions about the Loch Ness monster. Does it exist? And his answer was actually very important. I use it in my mafia business class. All right, if you're telling me that there is a big monster, an animal, in the lake in Scotland, then we already know two things about it. First, it's not alone, because they must breed. There is papa monster, mama monster, baby monster. Second, they must eat something once in a while. So let's look around. What possibly could be consumed by a large animal, by population of large animals in that lake? Unfortunately, in Loch Ness, there is nothing. There is not enough fish. And therefore, we must conclude that the question is not to a biologist, but to social psychologists. Why do people keep on citing the monsters there? With Azerbaijani regime, we understand, that all such regimes are losing their ground in almost not arithmetic, but geometrical progression, negatively, with the passage of every generation, which is, by the way, true of all the medieval dynasties. You look at them, or ancient dynasties. So the founder was the great guy, he seized the power. His nickname, Heydar Aliyev's nickname, internally was the Dragon. The nickname of his son was Baby Camel. Right, so he spent years trying to prove to the people, that he is as formidable as his father was, and his father was indeed formidable. To become KGB general, but that's not all. To survive the fall of Lavrenti Beria in 1953. That's really the mystery of Aliyev's dynasty. How did they survive 1953 Lavrenti Beria demise and Mir Jafar Bagirov, and continued? That's mystery number one. Mystery number two, there was a taboo for Secret Service officers to transition into the positions of political power. And yet, well, because political power and party officials were very afraid of KGB and KVD, whatever, GPU, after the times of Stalin. And yet, Heydar Aliyev made it all the way to Politburo membership. It's quite incredible. He fell out of grace under Gorbachev, and then he bounced back, as if doing nothing, because he was the dragon. When people saw him in action, he just appeared out of his village in Nakhchivan, and every Azerbaijani political actor or whatever, local mafiosi, they immediately understood their size. This is probably not exactly the case with his son. So his son needed to do something terrible, terrifying, and grandiose. And the nearest thing was probably ethnic cleansing in Artsakh, or reconquest, let's put it this way, solving the Armenian problem in Azerbaijan. And since there was very little on which to build the Second Azerbaijani Republic, to remind you, there was the first once, very much like in Armenia. And by the way, the Independence Day
is the same. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can look up Firuz Kazemzadeh, famous book, The Struggle for Transcaucasia. Why was it so? What happened in 1918? It's very instructive and very sobering to remember what happened back in 1918. So in the 1990s, essentially the whole legitimation of the Second Armenian Republic was, as you said, the struggle for Artsakh. Because there was nothing else to boast. One thing among the huge failures or tragedies of the Second Republic, which is elided, and I'm going to remind you, is the massacre in the parliament in 1999. I think that was the turning point. After that, somebody like Heydar Aliyev would never negotiate in good faith with Armenia or Armenians. He just knew that they would fall into his hands or his successors' hands as an overripe pear. You know, because these people would never have really a serious regime after that. So what was there? The memories of the great struggle. And for once in 1,000 years, Armenians won a war. So there was this realization, this justification for the whole regime, because there was no cultural achievement, no scientific, no economic, nothing, you know, how many people had left the country. But do you realize the situation in Azerbaijan was even direr? Except that, yes, of course, with oil money, you know, they managed to, you know, this is kind of, as somebody in Iran, I think very nicely said, that oil should be proclaimed haram to all Muslims, just like alcohol. Don't even hold in your hands, you know, because very few people did well after holding in your hands. So there were several imposing buildings created in downtown Baku, but then what is coming next? And probably some of the greatest cruelties and crimes in history are coming out of the sense of not just even weakness, inferiority. So that's the explanation, you know. So there was no party on the other side, you know, to agree with. Baku regime would not have survived any decent treaty. But in Yerevan, let's face it, you know, there were very few regimes in the last 31 years which would have survived such a treaty. So in a sense, what happened, you know, this ethnic cleansing was overdetermined, as we call it in social science, overdetermined. Too many causes going in the same direction.
Let's move on to, we always look at, the world is a dark place, and we always look at dark scenarios, which is the smart thing to do, but the opposites do happen also. We have looked back, now let's move forward. 20 years from now, 15 years from now, the Western pivot has worked to a great extent. You have an Armenia that is integrated into the West. You have an Armenia that is economically much more successful than now. A state that is stronger than now. A country that has the capacity to defend itself. What does that Armenia mean internally? And secondly, what would that Armenia mean regionally when most likely the opposite is going to be true for most of your neighbors?
You would need really good defenses, as you realize. You know, that whatever peace treaty or not, your neighborhood is not going to be peaceful. However, it's not only Western pivot, because it's not going to be only the West. It's also the Middle East. It's also places which we often ignore, but it could be, you know, do you realize just the size of places like Ethiopia and their history and their potential prospects, actually, you know. So when something bad happens in a place like Ethiopia, it's 100,000 people dead. As as the war showed, recently there, the civil war, the rebellion, And what was the war about? It was the central government trying to centralize the state, to bring provinces into the lockstep, and probably fortify their power, but also fortify it in the world position in the economy. So Ethiopia is a large market. Just one example. We often forget that Iran has, Armenians are very proud, that Armenians, the name Armenian is mentioned, since the 6th century BC, but it is mentioned on the Persian king's stela in Behistun. Right, that Iran is next door to us. It's a very large country. It's what, 2.5 times bigger than France. They have
much larger, yeah.
Maybe even larger, 3 times. Something, it's huge, and they're very historical. It's a great civilization, and they actually have a very large diaspora, very well connected, and they're next to the Arab monarchies of the Gulf, which have the money, and they're also trying to have a lot of money, and they're trying to put their act together. So do not forget, that Armenia is actually somewhere between Europe and that Middle East and that East Africa, larger Middle East, where Dubai might yet play the role of Hong Kong or Singapore, kind of the, not just safe haven, but safe for business, so the place, the financial hub where transactions might happen according to British commercial law. Which is probably important. We don't know. There is Israel there. If there is any future for Israel, it will be in reconciliation with its neighborhood, in bringing their technology, and they need the investment of Arab, which is now in the Arab monarchies, and they need the labor force, which is now in East Africa or in India. And they need the connections and the market acumen, which is in places like Iran. And definitely there is a niche for Armenia and Armenian diaspora in the world like that. So if we survive, as I joke, that if we survive the next 10 years, we are all right in the following 10 years.
That's quite optimistic. Well, one of the things that I've been quite cynical and negative about these so-called peace agreements, deals, because ultimately I see them. I think the best reference that I saw was actually from you, where I think you referred to it as some version of Brest-Litovsk. It's a retreat, playing for time, because ultimately, I don't see any kind of whatever signed, not signed. There's 2 0 hours heading our way. And one thing that the war in 2020 meant, that Armenia's fate is actually internal and external. It's tied to the dysfunctionalities of a very problematic neighbor. And that neighbor has 2 0 hours. It's when the regime ends or where oil ends, depending on the timeline, 10 years. Well, what we mean by oil ending is as a primary export income source, not as the oil could probably go on for many, many more years for internal use. And I'm convinced that either of those 2 0 hours will bring war, because what every Azeri leader or political type has learned is that you solve your internal problems with external aggression. Now, it might be that external aggression is happening against a much stronger Armenia 10 years from now, but I'm not optimistic about that. I think at the end of the day, there's going to be a third conflict. The issue is, how do you delay it and have it be as far away as possible? Do you agree with that assessment?
In part, yes. But you mentioned before experts dealing in alarmism. So I like to stress, and I need to repeat it again, that I'm not a political scientist or policy expert. I'm a historical sociologist. And for dark predictions, you just can talk to any taxi driver in Yerevan. For something brighter, you probably need already a professor of New York University. somebody like myself, it's very much like visiting a hospital where the doctor looks into your test results, your x-rays, and says, oh, how bad, how bad. You need a doctor who says that, okay, the situation is difficult, but there are a couple things we can try. So, first of all, bidding for time. When I said Brest-Litovsk Treaty, remind you again, so this is beginning of 1918. Russia, just after the Bolshevik Revolution, is totally prostrate. And this is the whole reason why Armenia becomes independent, by the way, because the Turkish army, the Ottomans, who were also prostrate, so this was a very strange situation, which is very useful to be reminded of, because this is a situation of World War where everyone seemed losing. French military could not send a single battalion into attack on German positions by 1917. They would mutiny. Germans were starving in the, just look into remarks, all quiet on the Western Front. Germans starved into defeat by 1918. The British were desperate, even the British, bring something unconventional, tanks, or on the other side, Lawrence of Arabia and his Bedouin armies. So you have to think in those terms. Lenin was probably not a very kind man, but he was a political genius because he was finding the pathways through the minefields. And when he insisted, that sign Brest-Litovsk Treaty now, he was betting on Germany and Ottoman Empire losing the war. Who could have predicted this in February or March 1918? But this would become the fact by November 1918. And then there would be the British coming into the Transcaucasia, and they would be expelled themselves, or they would leave, and then there would be the Red Army. So we shall see, sign it now, whatever it is, get the breathing space, but of course prepare, because it's going to be very rough riding. But also you have to, you have to realize the problems of your neighborhood. It's wrong to underestimate your opponents. But it's even more wrong to overestimate, to say that we are doomed, because Azerbaijani regime, Baku regime, is holding on 3 pillars. Oil, Erdogan, and Aliyev's family. Are you sure that 5 or 10 years from now, oil would still be at the same valuation, that Erdogan or whoever succeeds him will still be there, and that Aliyev family would still be capable of holding, to power? Because look what happened in places like Kazakhstan, just in 1922, right? So that's a lucky, actually, outcome, because Mr. Nazarbayev is still alive and his daughters are somewhere around. Well, maybe some of his...
In London.
Yeah. Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
Maybe in China. So you should be counting for the worst. You should be preparing. But you should also keep your options open. There could be sudden openings. There could be very unexpected things. And we are living in Armenia through a social revolution in a very deep sense. That my wife, to take her as the nearest example, could have been probably a dollar billionaire now had she not married me. And of course, if she were not a woman. Because she is one of the founders of IT industry in Armenia, out of desperation. She is a chemical engineer. She comes from a distinguished family of Soviet-era Armenian chemical engineers and scientists. In 1991, Armenian industry had collapsed within weeks because there were no more railroads, because there were environmental protests. To remind you, there was this horrible Nayarit artificial rubber factory. So her job disappeared forever. Everybody from her class actually left the country. She's the only one remaining here. And she educated herself again, thanks to American University in Yerevan, and thanks to diaspora and everybody. So if you wanted to see what happens 30 years on, that's my wife, that's her classmates. Yes, and they created, first as outsourcing platform competing with India on lower wages, actually, and higher skills, probably no. They did it, and had she not married me, had she participated in one of these startups, there would be probably a much bigger apartment, although I don't need probably anything bigger than that. And this place, my corner, has a deep political meaning, So I joke, that when the former classmates of my wife, who had left for places like God knows where, Delaware or in the middle of Germany, they come once in a year to visit their old country. So they come here, they see this, they look at the Ararat there, they think, what the hell am I doing there? Why am I not here? One of my wife's former business partners, just one of them, to my knowledge, has the personal wealth, very legally, in US dollars, bigger than all the underground oligarchs of the 1990s combined. All those men who owned restaurants, casinos, shops and bazaars in Yerevan. That's a social revolution. We have a new elite coming in. It has not manifested itself quite clearly, but just the fact that, let me ask you, what the hell are you doing in Yerevan? What the hell am I doing in Yerevan? Do you realize, or do our listeners realize, that we are basically in our fields where what Henrik Mkhitaryan is in football, or my wife's younger brother, Narek Akhnazaryan, the cellist, is doing in music. Why did he move back to Armenia? What are we doing here? And there will be more like us soon.
Fantastic. That's a very good close to get us to the close. But I have one last question, which is tied to, again, 23. It's a painful one for Armenians. And that is the people that are being held in Baku. And the issue is, you have to understand it from a practical point of view, because we obviously want these people out. Is this some cruelty spectacle by a cruel totalitarian regime, because that's what they do? Or are these people bargaining chips?
Well, as always, I suspect both. I suspect it's a sadistic pleasure, of a certain type there. And I cannot, well, you know that I was classmates with Ilham Aliyev, in Moscow back in 1978. And back then, I do remember, that we were freshmen. That's what elite colleges are about. You could become freshmen and classmates with son of a dictator. So his father was already, KGB general and candidate member, yet, he would become full member of Politburo of the Communist Party of Soviet Union eventually. So this guy was the son, this kid was the son of the man whose portraits were on every billboard. And he was a member of Politburo. And yet, obviously his father made a point, that his son lives in the dorms, like everybody. To remind me, there was a great joke at the time, so one of these Caucasus underground millionaire sons, presumably Georgian, could be Azeri or Armenian, writes back to his parents, I'm doing well in Moscow, just, other students give me looks, when I come in my Mercedes-Benz, to classes, because they're all coming by bus. So the father writes back to him, here is the money, buy yourself a bus, be like everybody. If this is what they do in Moscow, So Ilham was surrounded, always surrounded, by a coterie of the children of his father's minions, the Sekafans. But outside them was the second circle of, they never called themselves Azerbaijani at that time, they called themselves Bakinцы, the guys from Baku. They were the children of the enemies of his father. Enemies because their own parents had been in power before 1969, when Haydar Aliyev had been appointed. They were the erstwhile elite. So we see these kind of layers of elite accumulating in dictatorships throughout the Middle East. If they are not killed, they're usually somewhere in emigration, or they're keeping low, but they're biding their time. They were in Moscow because in Baku they had no chance. They would never be admitted into university there. So I was looking at and how Ilham was navigating that, with a smile. I was thinking, who the hell you are? You're 17 years old. You're a freshman. And where did you grow up? And what is your future? And now we see actually, we have the answer, what was his future. So don't even ask me, it doesn't take a sociologist. It doesn't take a political expert. It takes a writer the caliber of Émile Zola or Balzac or Hemingway to describe, Maxim Gorky, to describe, the evolution of such a twisted mind. It's a very cruel fate of our fellow Armenians, some of whom, many of whom, we know for sure. It's very cruel. It's worse than death in a sense, much worse, because there is suffering, very genuine suffering, and there is little hope. But let's hope that as long as there is a short, sort of tiny slimmer of hope, let's hope. If I were religious, as a sociologist, it's very difficult for me to be religious, even coming from a very long line of priests. Yes, my family goes back to the Crusades, to Cilicia, so 800 years of Catholic priests. They are, of course, not my direct ancestors because they were good Catholics, but somebody selected from the Derluguian family. If I could pray, I would pray. If not, at least raise a glass of good Artsakh brandy to them.
Georgi, it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to my corner. Come back again.